Disturbing cinematic hook. 8 seconds. They say the church bells rang that night even though the tower had no ropes, but no one dare speak of what they heard beneath the ground. You weren't meant to know this. But now, you do. Ashworth wasn't a village. It was a vault. A beautifully weathered, ivy-wrapped deception. England's countryside has always worn its secrets like a shroud. But Ashworth devoured its past and let it rot beneath cobbled streets and whispers between pews. In 1965, 4 souls stepped into that rot and never returned. Not because they ran, but because they were taken. Consumed by something older than the church, older than England, older than even memory. The Higgins family wasn't just devout. They were marked. Not by choice, not by sin, but by lineage. Chosen not to serve, but to be offered. The village knew. The vicar knew. And the land had been waiting. You see, history doesn't record the real workings of power. It sanitizes it, rewrites it. But the rituals they buried beneath St. Mary's Church, rituals outlawed, burned from the records, smeared as superstition, weren't forgotten. They were preserved, passed down through bloodlines like heirlooms, hidden behind scripture, protected by silence. And the Higgins were never just villagers. They were the key, the last piece, the necessary sacrifice to reactivate something that had been sleeping beneath the stone. The Church of England never addressed the disappearance. They sealed the records, boarded the cottage, and quietly paid off the only constable who got too close. But one room was missed. A hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's, sealed in 1712, uncovered by accident in 1966, ignored ever since. Within that room, pages written in Nina Higgins's own hand, dated 2 weeks after the day the family supposedly vanished. If that doesn't chill you, it should. Because this isn't just a disappearance. This is what it looks like when a community obeys a pact no one will admit exists and offers blood to keep the veil from tearing open. The Higgins family didn't disappear. They were processed. And tonight you'll understand why, not because you're curious, but because something has decided. It's time you remembered. The mistake people make is believing that evil comes loud, that it announces itself with fire and horns. It doesn't. It arrives with silence, with tradition, with tea served at dusk and hymns sung in the proper key. Evil in Ashworth wore a cassock, nodded politely in the streets, and preached from the pulpit about virtue. And behind closed doors, it taught mothers how to prepare their children for the offering. The Higgins family wasn't chosen randomly. Their blood carried something ancient, a genetic key, a resonance that aligned with what the old families called the pattern. You won't find the pattern in any official history. You'll only hear whispers of it in the journals smuggled out of 18th century Ashworth by a dissenting curate named Father Elric Rowden. His writings were found sewn into the lining of a traveler's cloak in 1871. And they speak of a rite, one that must be performed every 3rd generation. A family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, 1 male, 1 female of each. Balanced, symbolic, willing, or not. Now understand this. The villagers weren't brainwashed. They were indoctrinated, over centuries. A slow, calculated erosion of individual thought. Reverence for lineage. Obedience to the unseen. The old families knew that power doesn't just come from ruling the land. It comes from feeding it. And what they fed it was innocence, wrapped in scripture, cloaked in ritual. Nina had questions. That was her curse. Curiosity in Ashworth was like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The deeper she went, the more right it felt. The old knowledge seduces with familiarity, like déjà vu in a place you've never been. She called it history. The vicar called it communion. The villagers called it preservation. And Thomas Higgins? He called it madness. But by then it was too late. The pattern had already locked them in. The diary recovered beneath St. Mary's Due described the rituals in disturbing detail. Candle placements, salt circles, incantations in what was once believed to be corrupted Latin, but matched no known dialect. And drawings, endless drawings, identical to the ones Billy Higgins had begun sketching weeks before they vanished. This wasn't delusion, this was reenactment, and the script had been written long before the Higgins family ever drew breath. Tonight, you're not hearing a story. You're excavating a suppressed truth, one that institutions buried, because if it ever became widely known, the entire mythology of progress, of civility, of God's order, would fall. Let me tell you something most men will never hear. The world isn't run by governments, corporations, or even religions. It's run by continuity. Traditions older than reason, masked by institutions younger than the ink on their founding documents. Ashworth was one of the sites, a convergence point. And the Higgins family? They were born into it like lambs bred on sacred soil. That's the part most men miss. The role of blood, not belief, not behavior. Blood. In the old texts, the ones Father Rowden risked his life to protect, there's a concept called lineal resonance, a spiritual frequency passed through bloodlines that allows certain humans to act as keys, opening what was never meant to be unlocked. The Higginses, through the maternal Whitlock line, had it. Eleanor's grandmother had suppressed it. Her mother had denied it. Eleanor embraced it. Not because she was weak, because she felt the pull. You would too. Think about it. The world around you isn't built on truth. It's built on agreements, social contracts, psychological cages. But deep inside, every man knows when something's off, when the smiles are masks, when the ritual becomes theater. Eleanor stopped pretending. By October 1965, she wasn't just participating. She was leading. She began organizing the rites. She initiated the concept of full familial alignment, a euphemism for involving her husband and children. She argued that wholeness was required for the seal to take. The seal. That phrase repeats 19 times in her recovered journal. The seal must take. Only balanced blood can hold the seal. The seal cracks when legacy is denied. And then it gets worse. Reverend Whitmore introduced the idea of a return. He claimed that the rites would open not just a channel to the past, but to something waiting beneath it. Not metaphorically, physically. A consciousness, older than doctrine, a force that at once ruled the valleys before the Romans set foot in Britain. They called it the witness, never described, never questioned, just present. In the final journal entry, dated November 12th, 11 days after the Higginses were declared missing, Eleanor wrote only 4 words. The seal has taken. Understand this. What you're hearing isn't a tale of missing people. It's a system activating. And the question you need to ask isn't what happened to the Higgins family. It's this. What did their disappearance allow back in Mold? You were trained to believe history is a timeline, past to present, clean and progressive. But the truth is far more violent and far more cyclical. The people of Ashworth didn't stumble into darkness. They preserved it, deliberately, strategically. Because darkness, when harvested properly, grants power, the kind that doesn't come from elections or education, but from dominion over reality itself. Let's break the illusion. In 1985, When investigators finally accessed the restricted vestry records at St. Mary's, documents locked away for decades by the Diocese of Leeds, they discovered that the Higgins family wasn't the first to vanish. 3 prior disappearances, all family units, spaced roughly 60 years apart. 62, 1904, 943. Same configuration. 1 man, 1 woman, 1 boy, 1 girl, all connected to the founding bloodlines. All vanished around the harvest moon. Coincidence? No. It was continuity. A pattern too precise to be accident, too quiet to be noticed. The church labeled it folklore. The police called it unsolved, but one internal note in the 1985 file, unsigned, simply said, "The altar below was never deconsecrated. The rites remain in motion. The seal must not be broken prematurely." Now listen closely. That altar, the one found in the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's, was older than the church itself. Carbon dating put it around 500 BCE, pre-Roman, pre-Celtic. It was made from a black igneous stone, not native to Britain. No tool marks, no known method of transport. And carved into its surface, a spiral glyph that matches symbols found in Mesopotamian death cults, and on the Higgins boys' final drawings. So here's the question. How did an 8-year-old boy in 1965, with no access to historical texts, reproduce symbols that didn't even appear in academic literature until the early 2000s? Because the knowledge wasn't learned. It was inherited. This is the part no institution will admit. Memory doesn't just live in brains. It lives in blood, in the marrow, in the bone. The Higgins children didn't just learn the rituals. They were reactivated by them. And you, watching this now, you need to decide something. Do you still believe this is just a story? Or have you started to feel it too? That pull, that sick awareness that something beneath our world has been patiently watching. If you're ready to go deeper, comment below, "The seal has taken." Type it twice. Not for me, for yourself. Let it mark the moment your eyes stopped closing. 3 months after the Higgins family vanished, investigators finally broke into the catacombs beneath St. Mary's. What they found should have triggered a nationwide inquiry. It didn't. It was sealed. The space wasn't just a forgotten cellar. It was prepared. There were candle stubs arranged in concentric rings, strange metallic residues embedded in the stone, and in the center, 4 shallow depressions in the floor, perfectly aligned, as if made for bodies, too large, too small. No signs of struggle, no signs of escape, just a room that looked like it had been fed. On the far wall was a mural, long faded, recently restored using infrared photography. It depicted a crowned figure with no face, just a mirror where features should be. Surrounding it were 12 bowed figures, each with identical red symbols carved into their foreheads. Scholars who've seen it refer to this entity as Regus Specularum, the king of reflections. An entity whispered of in fringe theology as a watcher, not a judge, but a mirror of your soul's deepest fracture. You don't pray to it, you don't ask it for favors, you offer it echoes, moments, memories, bloodlines. And in return, it reflects back truth so raw it splits the mind. According to Eleanor's final writings, the ceremony wasn't meant to summon this being. It was meant to awaken its attention. A test. To see if the family could survive contact without losing identity. But there was a catch. Always is. The rites required alignment, body, spirit, and blood. If even one participant resisted, the balance shattered. And resistance did come. Thomas. He had begun to pull away, not loudly, not defiantly, but doubt had entered his heart. He loved his family, but feared what they were becoming. And doubt, in rituals this old, isn't weakness. It's corruption. One document found in the chamber, a vellum scroll older than the Reformatio, contained a single phrase repeated 40 times in Latin. He who resists the mirror shall be devoured by the echo. Devoured. So what happened that night? Was Thomas consumed, not physically, but spiritually? Was Eleanor taken, or did she transcend? We don't know, but what we do know is this. In the 6 decades since their disappearance, 4 more families have moved into that cottage. 3 have fled within months. 1 disappeared entirely in 1999. And the room beneath the church? It was bricked over in 1990 by order of the Archbishop. No explanation given. Just one line on the work order. No one must kneel there again. What happens to a village when its oldest truth is forbidden from speech? Ashworth didn't crumble. It adapted. Like a wound that scars over without healing, the village learned to live around the rot, to bury memory beneath manners, and terror beneath tea. But not everyone forgot. There are still locals, very old now, who speak in fragmented phrases, stopping just short of confession, not because they don't remember, but because they know remembering out loud makes it real again. One such man, name withheld by request, was 17 in 1965. He worked odd jobs at the church, mostly cleaning and tending the graveyard. He never spoke publicly about that Halloween night until 2021. When he finally did, he told a story that has never been released until now. He said he had been in the bell tower at 1:00 a.m., hiding, watching. He'd gone up there to escape his father's temper, not expecting to witness a ceremony. But he did. And what he described matches exactly what Eleanor wrote in her final journal. 12 robed figures, candles arranged in a geometric pattern around a pit that shouldn't have been there, chanting in a language that sounded older than stone. And in the center, the Higgins family, standing perfectly still. The witness described something chilling. Margaret, the 12-year-old, looked directly at him, from over 100 feet away, in darkness. She raised one hand and made a gesture, not a wave, something older. 3 fingers across her lips, 2 over her eyes. He never forgot it. Years later, he saw the same symbol carved on a tomb in southern France at a Templar ruin marked non sacratum, not sacred. But what broke him wasn't the ritual. It was what came after. Because just before dawn, the chanting stopped, the figures dispersed, the light vanished, and the family was gone. Not walked away, not carried off, just gone. Like the ground had oped, Ned and drank them. No footprints in the mud, no broken candles, just silence. He told no one, because he knew what he saw wasn't paranormal. It was permitted. He said, "The church didn't let it happen. The church was built because it happens." That's the secret, isn't it? Not that evil occurs, but that evil is administered, ritualized, curated. Ashworth isn't cursed. Ashworth is a machine, a mechanism designed to feed something ancient on schedule. And the Higgins family? They were just next in line. The church will never admit what St. Mary's was truly built for, because it was never meant to save. It was meant to seal, to hold something ancient in place, not through bricks, but through belief. The sermons, the hymns, the traditions, all camouflage, all ritual scaffolding to reinforce a prison. but prisons decay. And in Ashworth, the lock began to rust when the Higgins family entered the system. The hidden chamber beneath the church wasn't discovered in 1965. It was rediscovered. You see, in 1349, during the height of the Black Death, church records from the Diocese of York mention a heresy in Ashworth involving sanguinary rites, the silence of children, and the black hymn of inversion. The documents were sealed, buried in the Lambeth Palace archives for centuries. Until 1985. That year, two historians, working on a restoration project, gained access to sealed vestry logs from St. Mary's dating back 700 years. What they found? Disturbing symmetry. The same ritual structure. The same use of herbs, salt, symbols, and a family at the center. In fact, the 1349 entry listed the names of the vanished, Thomas, Eleanor, Margaret, and William. Exactly the same. That's when the theory emerged, one whispered in certain closed circles of historical theology. The Higgins family may not have been the first to disappear. They may have been a recurrence, a pattern, a bloodline pulled back into the same role, again and again, until the ritual succeeds. Because here's what no one wants to say. The purpose of the rites wasn't just to call something forth. It was to fuse something, to merge the bloodline with the mirror. So the entity, the king of reflections, could wear a human shape. That's why the journals describe mirroring exercises. Why the family began speaking in phrases that were not their own. Why Billy's drawings depicted faces he never saw but perfectly matched carvings from 12th century reliquaries in rural Italy. Some of the rituals weren't summoning spells. They were invitations. Invitations to become something else. And maybe that's why no one has ever found the bodies. Because the Higgins family didn't vanish. They were taken, rewritten, absorbed. And in their place, a silence too deep to echo. Now, if you're still watching, and I know you feel this crawling under your skin, I want you to comment the phrase, "No reflection is innocent." Type it twice. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because from this point forward, we're not just telling a story. We're changing who you are. What if I told you mirrors aren't passive? That the reflection you see is not always your own? The most dangerous aspect of the Higgins mystery isn't what happened to them. It's what they unlocked, and what may have slipped through. Because 3 months after their disappearance, the constabulary made a chilling discovery beneath St. Mary's Church. A sealed room. No record of its construction, no plans, no previous mention in any church documentation. But it was there. And what lay inside shattered every assumption about the Higgins case. Candles, still partially burned. Ritual markings scorched into the flagstone. Personal belongings of the Higgins family. Eleanor's shawl, Margaret's school notebook, Billy's sketchpad. Open to a page depicting the church tower split in half, with something crawling out. But the most disturbing object was found at the center of the chamber. A mirror. Not decorative, not antique. Just a plain, round mirror. But with no reflection, not even of light. It absorbed it. Black as polished void. Every flashlight beam disappeared into it. It didn't reflect. It consumed. One of the investigators, a young constable named Darren Fielding, reached out and touched its surface. Within 48 hours, he was institutionalized. According to his attending physician, he spoke only in riddles, muttering about a twin behind the glass and the children who walk backward. His final journal entry, written the morning before he stopped speaking entirely, reads, "They weren't taken. They were traded. The church keeps the gate, but something else holds the key. Every 300 years, it wants a family. Not for food, for form." What does that mean? It means the Higgins family may have been a sacrifice of reflection, a trade that allowed something unspeakable to wear a human shell. Not just mimicry, inhabitation. The ritual didn't fail. It worked. And the result wasn't an empty house. It was a doorway. That's why no further investigation was ever launched. Why the church refused to speak. Why Eleanor's final journal was locked behind ecclesiastical privilege for over 40 years. Because the truth was too powerful, not just dangerous to reveal, but dangerous to understand. Because once you know what the mirror really is, you start seeing it everywhere. There's a reason you're hearing this story now. Not in 1965, not in 1985 when the hidden chamber was uncovered, but now, when the veil is thinnest and eyes are beginning to open. Because the Higgins case isn't just about a family that vanished. It's about the architecture of control, the hidden systems that feed off obedience, tradition, and silence. Ask yourself, why would a church, the supposed guardian of truth, cover up the disappearance of an entire family? Why were Eleanor's journals classified under ecclesiastical secrecy? Why did local clergy receive direct correspondence from the Archbishop of Canterbury warning them to cease all inquiry? Because what was happening in Ashworth wasn't unique. It was part of a network, old parishes, old bloodlines, old pacts. We found records of 12 villages in northern England between 1204 and 1912, where entire families disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. Each case was closed. Each file marked resolved natural causes. Each had a sealed vestry chamber beneath the church. Different names, same blueprint. Let that sink in. You're looking at the shadow structure of a spiritual machine, one designed to maintain equilibrium between this world and something else. But equilibrium comes at a price. The machine requires offerings. And what better offering than a family? Bound by love. Ritual ready, trusting the very institution that would deliver them to the threshold. Here's what they don't want you to know. The church, not just in Ashworth but across Europe, preserved certain pre-Christian mechanisms, not to destroy them, to use them. Because power doesn't come from light. It comes from control. From holding a blade in one hand and forgiveness in the other. From deciding what to reveal and what to bury. But sometimes, that which is buried doesn't stay asleep, and when it wakes, it doesn't. To forget. Eleanor wrote in her final entry, "They gave us hymns to drown out the hum, but the stones remember, and the mirror is never truly empty, only waiting." Now ask yourself, what are the oldest buildings in your town? Who built them? And what lies beneath? By now, you're starting to feel it. The pressure behind your eyes, the dissonance between what you've always believed and what the evidence whispers. That's not discomfort, that's awakening. And once it starts, there's no turning back. In 1985, under the pretense of academic research, a private investigator named Harold Keane, formerly with British intelligence, was granted temporary access to sealed diocesan archives related to St. Mary's Church. What he discovered was so deeply disturbing, it was never published. But a redacted copy of his field report was leaked in 2002. What did it reveal? The Higgins family was not the first to vanish in Ashworth. They were the third. According to suppressed 18th century records, in 1672 and again in 1796, Entire families disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. Always in autumn, always linked to St. Mary's, always after an uptick in so-called folklore interest among the village elite. The pattern is undeniable. Every 84 to 94 years, a family disappears. But why that timing? Because that's the cycle of emergence. Old traditions, the real ones, don't track with our calendar. They follow deep time, energetic tides older than civilization. Think of them like harvests, but of souls. Keene's notes included ritual diagrams found beneath the altar, carved directly into the stone. Not Christian, not even pagan. Something older, symmetrical, hypnotic. Resembling modern sigil work, but with one chilling difference. They weren't designed to invoke. They were designed to anchor, to hold something in place. Something that doesn't live in time. Something that doesn't die, only sleeps. Eleanor wrote about it in her final journal. They call it the dweller, the one behind the walls, beneath the bells, beyond the veil. It doesn't eat. It doesn't hate. It waits. Here's where it gets worse. Keene traced the linea, G of Eleanor Higgins, and discovered she was a direct maternal descendant of the Whitlock family of 1672, the first recorded disappearance in Ashworth. Do you see it now? This wasn't random. It was ritual recursion. Blood calling to blood. Old debts resurfacing under new names. Before we continue, if you've stayed with me this far, you're not like other people. Comment the phrase, "The stones remember" twice, once for awareness, and once to lock in your transformation. You're not just hearing a story anymore, you're becoming it. Once you realize this wasn't a disappearance, but a transaction, everything changes. The Higgins family weren't taken. They were offered. You've been taught that evil comes with violence, with fire, with horns. But the most powerful evil doesn't announce itself. It wears a clerical collar. It smiles from the pulpit. It tells you everything is fine, while feeding something older beneath the floorboards. That's what happened in Ashworth. When forensic teams were finally granted access to the subchamber beneath St. Mary's in late 1985, they expected bones. They found something worse. The room was perfectly preserved. No dust, no decay. It had clearly been used recently. Along the curved walls were 12 alcoves, each bearing a different carved symbol, impossible to identify using any known runic or linguistic system. But every one of them matched drawings found in Billy Higgins's school notebooks. In the center stood a raised stone platform, not an altar, but something older. Engineered with mathematical precision, its angles aligned with ancient solstice markers and lunar geometry. On the walls, candle soot. On the ground, faint traces of iron-rich residue, not fresh blood, but something close. And in the far corner, concealed beneath a loose flagstone, they found Eleanor's journal. The final entry read, "We did not walk into the dark. We were called." The bells were never meant to warn. They're how it speaks. The veil is thinnest tonight. If you hear it, do not answer. If you see us, do not follow. You see the horror now? The bells, the rituals, the fog. These were not anomalies. They were protocols, designed to soften the edges of reality just enough to let something through. Ashworth wasn't haunted. It was a threshold. A maintained doorway, disguised as a parish. And the Higgins family? They weren't victims. They were activators. Chosen. Condi, it yawned, offered, in perfect obedience. But here's the real question. If this is happening in one village, how many more thresholds are there? You've felt this before, haven't you? The strange silence in an old church. The hum beneath the choir's song. The moment your instincts told you to leave, but you stayed, because the architecture made you feel small enough to obey. That's not imagination. That's conditioning. Institutions don't just teach us what to think. They train our nervous systems to respond to invisible hierarchies. Why do you think every ancient structure that survives, cathedrals, temples, Masonic lodges, follows the same spatial principles? Why are the ceilings high, the echoes sharp, and the windows colored with symbols no one can fully interpret? Because the geometry of obedience is real. Ashworth wasn't unique. It was refined. And St. Mary's Church? It was a machine. Not for worship, but for containment, and eventually, release. That's why the bells changed tone. That's why the fog came early. That's why Billy's drawings turned dark and precise. Every part of that village was a closed system, sealed from modern interference. Remember what Mrs. Thornton kept in her cottage? Books banned by the church. Lineage records going back centuries. And beneath the floorboards, traces of soil from Glastonbury, ashes from Lindisfarne, and something else. A broken obsidian disc, etched with spiral patterns. That artifact matched one discovered in 1907 at an excavation site in Anatolia, thousands of miles from Yorkshire, thousands of years apart. Identical. How did it get to Ashworth? Simple. Because what happened in Ashworth didn't start there. The rituals Eleanor performed, they weren't improvised. They were reactivations, part of a system scattered across Europe in fragments, encoded in folk practices, songs, herbal lore, and yes, in the architecture of forgotten chapels and hidden chambers. Each site was once a gate. Some were sealed, some were shattered. But a few, like St. Mary's, were simply left dormant, waiting for the right people at the right time. And in 1965, the sequence was completed. The bells did not toll for worship. They tolled for entry. Here's the part they never wanted recorded. In 1986, a year after the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's was opened and quickly resealed, a retired intelligence analyst named Colin Redham requested access to the sealed church files on Ashworth. He was denied. But Redham had connections. Cold War clearance. He got in. What he discovered would never make the official record. Buried among diocesan correspondence and redacted psychological reports was a pattern file. One that didn't belong to the church, stamped not with a cross, but with the sigil of a now-defunct British military division known only by its unofficial title, Order 9. Order 9 specialized in non-conventional cultural anomalies, unacknowledged phenomena, places and people believed to possess disruptive metaphysical properties. Ashworth was on their list. Had been since 1881. Why? Because every 73 years, precisely, a family vanished. But 1965 came early. Why did it break the pattern? Because the ritual was accelerated. Because Eleanor didn't stumble into the occult. She was descended from it. One of Order 9's oldest files referred to the Whitlock line, Eleanor's maiden name, as blood-bearers. Custodians of an unbroken maternal lineage trained to remember what the church forgot. The report stated, Subject E. Whitlock exhibits inherited affinity to Site 7 parameters. Exposure to dormant artifacts resulted in spontaneous glyph reproduction, symbolic glossolalia, and induced trance state upon contact with obsidian relics. Recommendation: observation, not intervention. They watched her. They watched Ashworth. And they let it happen. Why? Because every institution eventually serves a force older than itself. And once you see that, you stop asking, why didn't they stop it? You start asking, what are they preparing for? Now here's where your awareness becomes dangerous. Us. If you're still watching, I want you to comment this phrase twice, right now, to lock in your identity shift. The gates are real. I see them now. Again, the gates are real. I see them now. This isn't just a phrase. It's a signal to yourself and to the algorithm that you're done pretending the world is what they told you it was. By January 1966, the official story was sealed. The Higgins family disappeared without a trace. Case closed. But unofficially, the investigation continued. Because something was left behind. In the chamber beneath St. Mary's, behind a false wall, authorities found 4 small piles of ash, each atop an ancient carved pedestal. Each pile measured precisely 138 grams. Each pedestal bore a name: Thomas, Eleanor, Margaret, William. Next to the pedestals sat a 5th, empty. Its inscription: Whosoever breaks the chain. No one at the scene could explain it. The ashes weren't wood, weren't fabric. They were bone. Human. And yet, the local mortuary reported no heat damage in the chamber. No scorch marks. No evidence of fire. The bodies were gone, but what remained was something older. Something not bound by physical destruction. On the far wall of the chamber, investigators found a final message, scorched into the stone with a precision no tool could replicate. It read, "The bargain holds, the gate remains, the price renews." Most of the officers on that team never returned to Ashworth. 3 left the force. 1 reportedly took his own life 5 months later. But 1 stayed, quietly. Detective John Embley. A young man at the time, he made it his life's work to track similar incidents across the UK. Patterns of disappearance. Whispers of ancestral rites. The repetition of specific phrases, symbols, and bloodlines. He found 12 other sites, 12 villages, 12 chambers, all hidden beneath churches built on pre-Christian ground, all containing variations of the same design, a 5-pillar array, a spiral motif, a phrase inscribed in a forgotten tongue. But only Ashworth had completed the pattern. Why? Because Ashworth was never random. It was the keystone. A ritual that required a family of 4, specific in birth order, heritage, and proximity, to the site. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a fulfillment. And the chamber? Not a tomb. A waiting room. You feel it now, don't you? The threads tying this all together. Ashworth wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype.